Thanks for listening to FreshEd. It's been rewarding to produce this podcast for the thousands of listeners around the world, but it takes a lot of work to make these regular episodes. What sustains our effort are voluntary memberships from paying supporters. If you are enjoying FreshEd and would like to join our membership, please sign up at freshedpodcast.com. You can also sign up for our 10th anniversary celebration, which will take place on October 18th. I hope to see you there. This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we explore EdTech philanthropy inside schools in South Africa. My guest is Amy Stambach.
And in the case of collaboration schools, this management company in South Africa received foundation money, Dell Foundation money and others, and then donates the interest or income earned on investment from those donations to the project that the donor wants to support. And in this case, it's quite clear, it says that the donor wants to support collaboration schools that are then managed by the donors and their representatives.
Amy Stambach is Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her new book is entitled The Corporate Alibi, Capitalism and the Cultural Politics of U.S. Investments in Africa, which was published by the University of California Press. Amy Stambach, welcome to FreshEd.
Well, thanks, Will. It's wonderful to be here.
Congratulations on your new book. It was just absolutely fantastic to read, and in particular, the chapter on education, which is what we're going to kind of unpack today. So you have been studying in South Africa a school by the name, I think you call it, the Starling Vocational Technical School. And it's considered something called a collaboration school. And I think that's a unique term to South Africa. So what is a collaboration school to begin with?
These are government-funded but privately managed schools in South Africa. They're akin to U.S. charter schools, but more specifically, they're what we call a public-private partnership. In this case, that partnership involves the government education department, namely the provincial state, it's called the provincial or the state regional education department, a non-profit school operating partner, which is a managing partner, and the donors. And the intended aims of collaboration schools basically are not unlike charter schools. The aim is to raise achievement, to narrow inequalities, and indeed these schools are typically located in under-resourced and historically disadvantaged neighborhoods. But the research shows that such schools don't clearly improve outcomes. At best, they do integrate with the community in that they sort of have a community feel to it, and they serve regional economic interests. At worst, I would say collaboration schools prioritize donor benefits. But I would say for a fuller explanation of South African collaboration schools specifically, I would recommend Amélie Simone Herbert's work in volume 65 of the Comparative Ed Review, which is a special issue by Crystal Strong and colleagues. So yes, Simone Herbert's work gives a detailed explanation of what collaboration schools are.
Right. And so they're similar to the U.S. charter school, and they have certain intentions. They don't always live up to those intentions. But they also have some unique sort of features when it comes to what they're allowed to do legally that sort of public schools are not. So, how do they differ from public schools?
The main difference has to do with management and administration, also with teacher professionalization. So, and all of that comes also along with what's taught. So the content of what is taught is also under the school board's direction. Now, in South Africa, collaboration schools, they receive operational support and funding from what's called a school operating partner and donors. And the school operating partner and donors create a school board, but if it's called a self-appointed governing body that runs the school, and it's exempt from many public school laws and regulations, or they have a different sort of way that they are approved to go about doing the business, if you will, of schooling. And it is a business. For example, more than half of the school governing body at collaboration schools, more than half is made up of the school operating partners and donors. And that's the private side. Those are appointed. There is a parent group and teacher group that is elected, but usually, from what I found, under the direction, those who are nominated and elected are nominated by the school governing body and the school operating partners and donors. So at the collaboration schools, what's really important is that the private side holds a numeric majority on the board. And this means that the donors and the school operating partner, the management partner, they can make decisions about the school, not the parents and not the professional educators, nor even government administrators. That majority on the school operating board means that the decision-making power is in that private side of the operation. Now at Starling, the school board lobbied for exemptions to the government, to the public regulations. They lobbied for different hiring and firing criteria. They lobbied to pay teachers less than in the fully state schools. And they lobbied that teachers could skip required professional development, teacher training programs, continuous professional development.
What's their rationale for lobbying the government for their ability to hire and fire teachers differently, to pay teachers less, and to presumably not do as much professional development? It seems like it would be an easy thing to say, no, you can't do that.
Right. The operating principle here is that flexibility, entrepreneurship, sort of having the decision-making, connected with the school itself, even though it's not the parents or the teachers making the decision, that the flexibility gives the school more vibrancy and creativity. So there's a sense that, government agencies, professional teacher programs are bureaucratic and overly rigid. At the same time, I want to mention that the collaboration schools have also been able to lobby for exemptions to some of the telecommunications issues that South Africa has, which is relevant to the collaboration school that I discuss in the book.
And how so? How is it relevant to the school?
Well, sure. The collaboration school, not unlike a charter school, has a particular charter or mission. And one of the charters in this school is that it introduces students to technology. And a request that the school operating body made of the regional education body, the government body, was that the school wanted to have an internet service provider that was private rather than government controlled. And initially, the Western Cape Provincial Department of Education did not accept that. You can imagine a school public system would want to be able to hold and monitor public school students' data. But in this case, the collaboration school wanted itself to hold and monitor the school's digital data. They also wanted to intensify surveillance at the school that government-run public schools and teachers' unions would never have allowed.
Right. So, and they were able to get away with this because they can be exempt from certain government laws and regulations.
That's right. They worked over, some time to get that exemption. It didn't happen automatically. But when I was working with professional teachers in South Africa, the idea that there could be surveillance cameras in classrooms or, was not acceptable. Wasn't the teachers union would not have allowed that at all. So this was a major exemption.
And so what does the school sort of hope to get from some of the surveillance? So this is the idea, is that there's cameras in classrooms? Like, what are they going to get out of this?
Well, a couple of things. On the one hand, it's not a lot of data, bits and bytes that they're collecting, but there is a discipline management issue. The students are coming from areas, as I said, that are under-resourced, have stretched infrastructure already. There's a history in some schools of fetal alcohol syndrome, given that some of the schools are located in agricultural areas, vineyards, where endemically there is documented record of alcohol abuse, and that has unfortunately translated or come down to students. So there's a higher rate of special needs, I would say, intellectual needs, cognitive needs, physical needs, and social emotional needs. The mission, or the charter, or the focus of the school is to instill discipline. And so surveillance cameras are a way of sort of telling students you're being recorded. And it's an overt, this is your discipline. This is what's keeping your behavior in check.
It's very much Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm happy that you mentioned that. It's not the layout of schools, but it is the digital tracking. Students in some schools go through full airport surveillance, checking for not only weapons, but also substances.
Yeah, and it doesn't even matter if anyone's watching the other end of the footage. It's just the idea that it's there and you're being watched. People will self-govern themselves to be disciplined.
That's right. These are younger children who are getting this lesson in their bodies quite young. Yeah, quite early.
Okay, and I want to now turn to some of these donors, because this school that you were working in, one of the main donors that you write about is the Dell Foundation, so the Dell computers. And so we're talking about surveillance and cameras and EdTech, and here's Dell donating money to this school in South Africa. So how on earth does this donation work, just sort of on a practical level? Like, how do they get the money into the country and into the school?
Well, first of all, I would encourage you and everyone to look at the website ProPublica at their Nonprofit Explorer. If you go on to propublica.org, Nonprofit Explorer, and search for the Dell Foundation and any foundation, you can see where funds are spent, charitable funds are. And one of the funding recipients is a management trust company in South Africa that takes the donors' money, takes the Dell Foundation's money and others. And this managed trust, which is a financial structure where a professional trustee manages a pool of donors' money and invests that money in a portfolio of assets like property or shares or bonds. And in the case of collaboration schools, this management company in South Africa receives foundation money, Dell Foundation money and others, and then donates the interest or income earned on investment from those donations to the project that the donor wants to support. And in this case, it's quite clear, it says that the donor wants to support collaboration schools that are then managed by the donors and their representatives.
Wow. So how much money are we about that ends up going to these schools?
Well, I'll give you one data point. In 2021, COVID era and so on, Dell sent about 2.1 million US dollars to the South African management company, which then used that 2.1 million US dollars for collaboration schooling. And that amount doubled the school's, more than doubled, I should say, doubled the school's government allocation of funds. So again, more than 50%, it's more than half donor money that's working the school. And so the Dell Foundation's wealth is invested and rooted via the management company in South Africa for buying equipment, paying staff, and contractors.
Now, are there any tax implications here? It's an interesting structure to invest money in a trust, and then it's only the returns on investment that then get donated out. Is there an interesting financial mechanism here that is actually benefiting Dell and perhaps other donors into that trust, in terms of tax breaks or tax expenditures?
Well, I think of this as twice untaxed dividends. When you donate, your donations are not taxed in the US, nor are they taxed in South Africa as they move through the philanthropic structure. So that sort of reflects how charitable trusts avoid taxes on portions of investment income, so long as they give that investment income away. So again, the management trust is taking the donation, investing it, and then that excess, or people say the assets, income earned on that is then donated. And there's the tax benefits. They do vary depending country to country, but I call it a twice untaxed dividend. And I go further and I see these are really tax breaks for corporations, which vary by the kind of corporate foundation involved. And now, of course, not of course, but as you may know, the change in the US with the recent big bill has changed the corporate tax laws. And so the big, beautiful-ish bill shoehorned into a US government a new kind of sort of way of thinking of these, I should say into a new US single-party government has shoehorned the way that these charitable foundations will be run in the future, but it's to the benefit of the charitable foundations and the income earned on assets.
And how does Dell present its charity to a school, like a collaboration school? The money ends up coming to, or at least part of the earnings end up getting invested into.
Let me say the school itself, students don't know, who the donor is. So there's no big celebration party. It's more the way in which on platforms, internet platforms and so on, the Susan L. Michael Dell Foundation is credited with supporting educational transformation in poorer communities in South Africa. And so I argue, though, that rhetoric itself functions as an alibi that masks, or a kind of cover story that masks how the charitable giving also advances indirectly Dell's commercial interests.
How so?
I argue that Dell's charity in impoverished communities furthers their educational technology business. The foundation funds pipelines and infrastructure that align with the industry's markets, that align with Dell's markets. For example, in addition to the collaboration school, there's also funding for training data administrators, for training EdTech startups, and sometimes graduates from collaboration schools are pulled into EdTech startups. Sometimes teachers are pulled into EdTech startups. And these EdTech startups often have, sometimes they have online schooling or tech training initiatives. They have district management platforms and so on. So schools like Starling, the collaboration school I focus on in the book, become test beds to pilot surveillance tools, to generate case studies, to build relationships with officials, educators, and to normalize, for students, for teachers, everyone, to normalize heavy tech purchasing, expensive heavy tech purchasing, which, as you know, higher education institutions spend a lot on updating and maintaining EdTech. The same kind of, free gifts of a kind of a lab, a technology lab, helps to show that the benefits are generous, but in fact, the benefits help the industry, the benefits help Dell and allied firms expand their markets.
So when you walk through Starling, do you see Dell computers everywhere?
You do, but when I was there recently, you saw them behind lock and key because the internet provider was not yet approved. The private internet provider had not been approved. So at the time, the student computers were not available to students, and the surveillance cameras, I can only infer, but you raise a good question. The surveillance cameras data must have been housed locally rather than provided to the public administration.
In your ethnographic work, did you see any sort of pedagogical value of having all of this EdTech in the school?
It depends what you mean by pedagogy, because the disciplining body was definitely a learned student behavior. I was in a classroom where in the corner, the camera was clear and the teacher pointed to the camera. Pedagogically, in terms of using computers for communication, for expression, for literacy, I did not see that at all. I was aware that students were aware of drones that were filming sports events at the school. And so there's a kind of pedagogic quality there of knowing that you're going to appear on camera somewhere to someone, and you have a role to play in something. But in terms of translating that skill into understanding how that technology worked, no. And so it was a bit of a black box, really. How does that technology work for students?
In your book, you sort of make an argument that the use of EdTech in a school like Starling parallels colonial legacies of wealth extraction, which have historically been present in a place like South Africa. So how do you see that sort of historical relationship and legacy, and how does it sort of perpetuate wealth inequality and disparities today?
Yeah, I explicitly draw the parallel that the mining of student data at Starling parallels colonial legacies of wealth extraction. And I would say that foreign, mainly US firms in the digital world control infrastructure and extract value, which is really the value or the data. Now, I understand that, I said that there's the computers are not in schools taking keystrokes and getting students' consumer profiles, but the other startups that are being funded, the youth workplace shops, those are areas where students are learning computer and skills or have them already, and they're downloading music, they're synthesizing. And in some ways, it's not the product that they're making, it's the digital data, and it's really the data that is extracting value, deepening dependencies and reproducing global disparities. And some scholars, and I echo this, call digital capitalism or surveillance capitalism. That the digital money, the digital currency is like the critical minerals. It's not the minerals that are being expropriated and exported, but it's the surveillance system, the scanning gates, the purchase tracking software, the drones that are in fact geared towards serving the industry and the donor optics more than servicing children's learning experience.
And because this is the Dell Foundation donating money, you end up talking about how this is, you would call it venture philanthropy, or is it vulture philanthropy? What's the word?
Oh, I haven't heard that one. You coined that one, I believe. That philanthropic charitable giving redounds, the benefit of that giving redounds not directly to the investor, but to the investor's industry, to the investor's interests. And that's a lot of people have written about that. I would recommend everyone. In fact, I think you've interviewed several on your podcast. So please, I would draw people's attention to other recordings. But yeah, that the venture philanthropy is a kind of philanthropy that is both. I mean, every bit of philanthropy sort of redounds to the social standing of the benefactor. But in this case, the financial contribution enforces the financial interests of the donor.
Right. It's like the donor comes first and the recipient sort of second.
Right. I would say that like donations are positioned as a social investment that's tied to a donor's business, which creates a corporation, philanthropy, corporation loop or a circle of privatization.
Yeah, exactly. Because, you know, in this sort of loop, you don't see much public or public value or public good being sort of articulated.
That's right. Yeah, you don't have a sense of building community, even though the school is situated and featured as a community school. Instead, what happens is that governance is privatized. The governance of the school is in the private sector. One sees a weakened tax base, arguably, if funds were used for redistribution across all schools. And it also promotes, as I said, surveillance. The situation channels public loyalty toward the donors themselves rather than to democratic institutions or civil society institutions. And yet it returns IP, markets, prestige back to the donor and the industry.
And how would this compare to other sort of schools in South Africa that are supported through philanthropic donations? And the one that you bring up in your book, I never even heard of this, but it's the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls. And I was blown away when I was reading this, how Oprah donated $40 million, a long time ago, and it's been around for quite some time. How do you understand a school like this Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls compared to the Starling collaboration school that is being funded through EdTech companies?
Right. Well, first of all, Will, I have to say, I'm so surprised you've never heard of the Oprah Winfrey School. That's telling, because it's really not the subject of a lot of media attention, although when it opened, it had been. But to me, Oprah's $40 million boarding school is not feeding the tech product pipeline back into her business. Controversies of the school have focused on importing American celebrity values, some class tensions, maybe even reproducing social privilege. But it's not a venture philanthropy circle. It's not that circle of donating to something that helps your own assets increase. But still, like other elite gifts, it can produce dependencies and it can shift influence from the state to private benefactors. And I think it's interesting to think, like right now, in the US, there's a lot of government power that is affecting what the Department of Education is and is not funding, what the State Department is and is not funding. And, people are beginning or have lost, a lot of trust in government. And I can only say I'm hopeful that actually, if and when we all support democratically elected governments and recognize the plurality of views that are necessary, it's a less corrupt system than having a concentration of power in a small oligarchic elite or a small donor class.
It also sometimes feels like the history of schooling worldwide, but also in, say, the United States, where it sort of originated from, more of a religious base, but also sort of a philanthropic base where, like, there wasn't taxes that were funding public schools. And so we might have started with private donations to keep schooling open. Then we moved to like a pretty elaborate system of taxation that would actually fund public schools. And it's like we're moving in this direction recently where we're relying, rather than on taxation, we're relying on philanthropic donations to fund schooling, or what otherwise would have been public schooling.
Yeah, in fact. And of course, when you rely on the gift, you rely on the gift in education, the donor has power. I'm going to mix my cities, but no, I will tell you, in ancient Athens, as I discuss in this chapter, the Athenians would not allow private benefactors to fund public issues because they knew that the benefactor would have power over the polity. And unlike Sparta, which did, Athens maintained that sense of democratic openness and collectivity.
So maybe by way of conclusion, I mean, you mentioned this briefly, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more around how you see some of these forms of philanthropy as a form of corruption. So how so? And why is that important?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I do think this is a form of corruption. My claim is really blunt. The corruption is the system itself. Wealth extraction and data expropriation dressed as charity is not a gift. It's an interest. Corporate-led, corporate EdTech philanthropy, by undercutting public finance and accountability, by working around democratically elected governments, as difficult as they can be, corporate EdTech philanthropy moves societies toward oligarchic governance, while it's really trying or proclaiming to fix the very inequalities that it's profiting from. And that's a conundrum. It's really hard to see. It's hard not to accept a gift when it's such a kind gesture. I'm reminded of Michael Apple's phrase of many years ago. How can what is problematic look so good? How can it be bad when it looks so good, helping the poor and so on? And I guess I would say that education is a public good. And Horace Mann, as you know, years ago in 1848, wanted to move away from the independent different schools and fund a state system, the Massachusetts state system of common school, because he and others were well aware of the inequalities that were arising in the United States and the social precarity. They were looking to Europe, revolutions, unrest in Europe, and in order to equalize the inequalities, a common school was crucial. I know we fight over that common core. There is no common core. We go from, wanting to have like a collective body of knowledge to really arguing over what that collective body of knowledge should be and how to educate children. And I think that's what you should be doing. That's what we should be doing, educating for the common good and having arguments about education and public education, not thanking benefactors.
Well, Amy Stambach, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Congratulations on your book. Really a fantastic read, highly recommended. And please come back on the show when you have your next book out.
Oh, thank you so much, Will. It's a pleasure.
Amy Stambach is Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her new book is The Corporate Alibi. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Angunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements, and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.